Welcome back. This lecture is on conditioning and learning. So learning isn't just the intellectual exercise we often think that it is. What psychologists have discovered and studied for a long time is that learning can also be kind of a reflex. It can be a very reflexive or responsive process, and it's constantly happening. Whether we're aware of it or not, we're always making associations between things. And so our behavior is constantly being altered and changed by our experience, whether we know it or not. And this is a really important form of learning, and that's known as conditioning, and that'll be um, the topic of this lecture. So in this lecture, I'm going to review the one approach to psychology, which is known as behaviorism. I'm also going to then review two types of conditioning, the most well-known types of conditioning, which is classical conditioning, which was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, and then instrumental and operant conditioning. And then I'll also review social learning, which is the idea that we can learn things merely through observing the actions of others. So after watching this lecture, I hope that you'll, one, know both classical and instrumental conditioning, but be able to distinguish between the two, know the important features about each one, each of these types of learning, and how they work. Understand how classical conditioning and operant conditioning work separately and together to influence animal and human behavior. I'll actually spend less time on this, but this one is definitely in the NOBA reading, so make sure you get that out of it. And then describe how observational learning happens according to social learning theory. So, behaviorism is a psychological approach that's focused on the measurement of observable behavior rather than internal processes such as thoughts. So, many behaviorists really rejected the idea that we have mental processes that determine our behavior. And this might seem pretty weird, but behaviorism was actually the guiding perspective in psychology for several decades from around the 1930s to the 1960s. It was started by somebody named John Watson, based on the original ideas of Pavlov, and it was really through the work of B.F. Skinner that we learned the most about conditioning and behaviorism, and it's Skinner that is most kind of famously associated with behaviorism. So behaviorists thought that people as well as animals are very heavily influenced by outside factors. So when we've got this nature-nurture debate that I've lectured on several times in this class, behaviorists were very much on the nurture side. They thought almost everything was nurture. So really the two champions of behaviorism that we'll talk about, there was a couple, but I'll talk about Pavlov as well as Skinner. Each of these individuals contributed very important theories that demonstrate the effects of psychological conditioning. And so we'll talk about Pavlov. I'll talk about Pavlov first and his idea of classical conditioning. So Pavlov wasn't even a psychologist. He was a medical doctor, and so he studied physiology and medicine. It was actually in 1904 that he won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine based on his research on the properties of saliva and salivation in digestion. So he, it was during his research studying the digestion of dogs and then later children, but specifically his research with dogs, that he kind of accidentally discovered the process of classical conditioning. So what he would do is he would actually give the dogs food, and then he externalized one of their salivary ducts, and then he was able to collect saliva, and so that's what he was doing. But he noticed that even before the dogs got the food, they started salivating. And then what he also noticed is that dogs were salivating even before the sight of food, is that even by hearing the footsteps walking down the hall, he noticed that dogs were starting to salivate. So he thought, well, isn't this kind of interesting? I wonder if dogs are making the connection between certain stimuli, sights and sounds, with the food. And so he later used all kinds of different stimuli like metronomes and lights and bells. And what he found is that putting any stimulus together with the food could eventually lead the dogs to salivate even without the food present. Okay, so that by pairing some stimulus with the food enough times, that eventually the stimulus, he's most often known for ringing the bell, that the ringing the bell would ultimately lead the dogs to salivate without the food present. So this is a link that's posted in Canvas, but there's a short bio of Pavlov as well as an overview of his famous studies. Before I go over kind of the principles of classical conditioning, it's important to have the terminology. Okay, so one piece of terminology is unconditioned stimulus. And so this is a stimulus that elicits a particular response without prior training. Okay, so we can think of this as an automatic trigger, like the smell of baking cookies, right? It makes you hungry, and that's an unconditioned stimulus because you don't have to learn it. You just have that response. Okay, that response would be the unconditioned response. So it's a response that occurs to a stimulus without training. So we can think of this as an automatic response. So we start to drool, our digestive juices get going when we smell the baking cookies. A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that does not elicit a particular response initially, but comes to do so as a result of classical conditioning. So hearing certain noises in the kitchen that make you recognize that somebody is about to bake cookies, like the sound of a cookie tray, that stimulus, the sound of a cookie tray, in and of itself wouldn't cause you to drool, but it's only because that sound of the cookie tray is paired with the smell, which is ultimately related to the cookie itself, and it's because of that association that then leads to a conditioned response. So a conditioned response is a response that depends on the association with the original unconditioned stimulus. So this is a conditioned response is a learned response. So conditioned is just another word for learning. Importantly, the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are the same. So starting to salivate, feeling your digestive juices, you can kind of feel your stomach rumbling. That is the unconditioned response at the smell and sight of cookies, but that is also the conditioned response at the sound of the cookie tray. All right, so let's go back to the original, Pavlov's original studies and experiments. So in his experiments, the conditioned stimulus is the bell, because at first that doesn't do anything. And so by definition, that's the property of the conditioned stimulus, is that at first it doesn't produce any kind of a response. However, when the dog smells the meat, it salivates. So the meat is the unconditioned stimulus because it creates or elicits an unconditioned response. Okay, so it's unlearned. You don't have to learn. The dog didn't learn to salivate because of the meat. It's an automatic reaction to a stimulus. So this is an unconditioned stimulus. But then what Pavlov did is that over many trials, the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, is rung at the same time that the food is presented. So the dog smells and sees the meat and begins to salivate. Eventually, through the process of classical conditioning, when the dog hears the bell, the conditioned stimulus, it begins to salivate even in the absence of meat. So the salivation in the absence of the meat in response to the conditioned stimulus is a conditioned response. Again, notice that the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are the same, but the conditioned response is elicited from the conditioned stimulus in the absence of the original unconditioned stimulus. Okay. Here's a fun example for fans of The Office. I know we have several in this class. There's an example of classical conditioning. So it's for fun, but when you watch the video, try to identify the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response. I've got the answers on the next slide. I'm just going to go straight through that next slide so I don't spoil it. There it is. All right. Let me give you another example of classical conditioning. Have you ever experienced a situation in a high school class or a college class when your teacher or your instructor or your professor says, I want you to take out a blank sheet of paper. I want you to take out a pen. Put all your books and binders or other supplies on the floor. Put your cell phones away. Get your pens ready. So, what was happening in that last slide? How are you feeling now? Did that evoke any memories for you? Did that remind you of anything? So those are typically the instructions that happen before a professor is going to give a surprise quiz or a pop quiz. And if anybody is kind of remembering that you would often feel nervous or anxious, this is a good example of how test anxiety can be a learned behavior, a conditioned emotional response. So originally, if you think about those instructions can really be considered a conditioned stimulus because there's no objective reason for those instructions that were on the previous slide or that you typically hear to necessarily cause any emotional response. Okay? So the instructions themselves, taking out a blank sheet of paper, that's not inherently anxiety provoking. Indeed, you might remember days from your childhood where taking out a blank sheet of paper was a good thing because it meant you got to draw. So there's nothing inherently anxiety provoking about the questions, the instructions. However, it's because those specific set of instructions have become associated with the quiz that those instructions can produce a conditioned emotional response. Indeed, the quiz itself isn't the unconditioned stimulus because that creates anxiety, especially when we haven't studied. It's inherently an anxiety-provoking experience to be tested, especially when we don't know anything. So over many trials, the instructions, which again, inherently nothing particularly anxiety-provoking about the instructions themselves, but when they're paired with the quiz, we feel the anxiety, and so it's the instructions themselves that produce anxiety. And so maybe you've even felt a sigh of relief when kind of a similar setup. Sometimes professors like to play jokes. They'll go through a similar setup, like, okay, put everything away, put your phones away, take out a blank sheet of paper, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, what is this going to be? Anxiety is even starting to be produced, but we don't know what it is yet. And so sometimes it's like, okay, hey, we're going to do a fun activity now. It's like, whew, I wasn't expecting that. Okay, so what this little simple example was meant to do is hopefully to convince you that our emotional responses can be learned and conditioned through this process of classical conditioning. Now, being able to condition an emotional response was something that two psychologists, John Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, are very famous for attempting to basically provide evidence for. And we can say that they're infamous because this kind of what is known as this Little Albert study is one of the most infamous studies in psychology. Basically, the John Watson, who's one of these founders of behaviorism, he thought that the fearful response of children to loud noises is an innate, unconditioned response. But he wanted to know, could children essentially be conditioned and learn to have a fear response um, uh, by being presented with a stimulus that would not normally arouse fear in a child. And in this case, he used furry objects. He wanted to know, hey, could I condition a child to be afraid of furry objects? So for his study, he chose a 9-month-old infant from a nearby hospital who was just referred to as Albert. And so he followed the procedures basically that Pavlov had used to condition his dogs. So Albert was exposed very briefly to a white rabbit, a white lab rat, a dog, a monkey, other furry things. And initially he didn't show any fear of them during baseline tests. But then for the experiment, Albert was put on a mattress on a table in a room, and then the white lab rat was placed near Albert and he was allowed to play with it. But then Watson and his graduate student Rayner made a loud sound behind the baby's back by basically striking a steel bar with a hammer. And so each time Albert would reach out to touch the rat, they made this loud noise. And so Albert responded, of course, by crying and then showing fear, being afraid. So after several pairings between the two stimuli, at least what Watson said was that Albert was presented, when he was presented only with the rat, he would cry and crawl away. And they were able to also show, at least this is what is reported in the original study, is that he also would generalize the stimulus to other things. So other furry objects, even Watson wearing the mask. And so you can see here, I've got a YouTube here, and so you can there's the old footage of the experiment. So this has been quite a controversial study. Some people have criticized the study, even digging into the original report, saying, yeah, I'm not so sure that you actually showed evidence of fear conditioning. Like you said, there's no strong evidence based on your write-up that you actually did what you said that you did, which is to make poor little Albert afraid of a white rat or other similar stimuli. There's also been, historians have also tried to figure out the identity of this little boy. There's competing theories about who he was. Some say that he was a child of a worker at the hospital who was kind of like coerced to give up her son to participate in this study, but it's not clear. Watson's been criticized for not necessarily doing a follow-up to make sure that the child was okay. There's every reason to believe he would be okay based on some principles that I'm going to share later on, but this continues to be one of the most famous and really infamous studies in psychology. One, because of how cruel the experimenters were to do this to a child, but it's difficult to kind of minimize the impact. Is that this particular study, as well as the work of Pavlov, really did inspire quite a bit of research that came next that had to do with classical conditioning and understanding how our mind forms associations between stimuli, and how we can indeed form fear responses um, to stimuli that are not themselves scary. And so this work really inspired a lot of research on understanding phobias, as a for example. So that's a little Albert study. Now I want to share that there are many examples of classical conditioning in our everyday lives. So in our lives, and you can think of these, we've learned many associations, we've formed memories with different sights and smells, sounds and textures. Some of these associations are pleasant. So I know a lot of people have been classically conditioned by fast food signs, so that when you see the golden arches, okay, there's nothing inherently pleasing about looking at that shape of the McDonald's sign. But there's been many repeated trials in which we see the golden arches, we're hungry, so we drive through the drive-through, and then we get some food that smells and tastes really good, right? So every time we see those golden arches, that can say, that's looking really good to me. You can think of the sights and smells that are associated with a place that you were maybe really fond of growing up, like the sights and sounds of grandma's house. Okay, maybe you got treats at grandma's house, and so there's certain things, certain stimuli that were associated with the treats that we got. Then when we see those same stimuli, it could be just a reminder of what grandma's house looked like. We have a pleasant memory because we have that pleasant association. Now, of course, we can also have unpleasant associations. Here's just an example. A child of an alcoholic parent might experience anxiety at the sound of a can opening. Okay, if they're used to their parent drinking beers out of a can, and they drink a lot of those and then become potentially violent or abusive. So there's nothing inherently unpleasant about the sound of an opening can. In fact, that can be very pleasant for some people. But because of the set of conditions in which that otherwise neutral stimulus was then always paired with an unconditioned stimulus, which is, say, verbal or physical abuse, that unconditioned stimulus then got associated with the emotional response of experiencing fear or anxiety. Classical conditioning has also been used to explain other more specific examples. So drug craving and relapses can at least partially be explained by the principles of classical conditioning. So if you think about somebody that, let's just say, is a smoker or a vapor. I know less people smoke now, more people vape. Somebody who was in the habit of smoking in their car, either because, got off their shift at work, or they're done with school, go to the car, light up the cigarette, or they vape in the car. The car itself then becomes a cue for the nicotine. Okay, so the nicotine itself is the unconditioned stimulus, and then the pleasurable feelings that we get from ingesting that nicotine is the unconditioned response. But think about somebody who's trying to quit. They have that association with their car, and so then every time they get in the car, they are expecting that pleasurable feeling from the nicotine, and then they don't give it. So that can be very difficult for quitting because of the craving that can happen by being in a similar environment in which one had the drug use. And that would apply, of course, beyond smoking, but for people that are trying to quit drugs or to get off drugs, when they find themselves in the same settings with the same friends or with the same people, sometimes they're not friends, the setting and the people can become stimuli that then kind of create the craving, because their body is used to getting that drug in the same setting. So those are triggering cues. The same thing can work with food craving. So many people have developed a habit, I know I certainly have, is I like to have a snack if I sit down and watch some TV. So long day, at the end of the day, I'm gonna sit down, maybe watch a TV program and have a little snack, sweet snack, salty snack, whatever it is. Okay. Well, for people that are going on a diet and they're thinking to themselves, yeah, I should really cut out the late night snacking. That's not a good thing. But they continue the habit of, yeah, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna watch a program at the end of the day. That same sequence of events, sitting on the couch or wherever we're watching the program itself, the TV, these can all become cues for the food, because the food is always paired with, the same chair, the same couch, the watching of the TV. And so we're not too dissimilar from Pavlov's dogs, is that our digestive process actually starts because we've associated the otherwise unconditioned stimuli, or the otherwise conditioned stimuli with the unconditioned stimuli. Okay, so we've associated couch with food. So every time I sit my butt on the couch, and you've probably noticed that, you're like, man, feeling pretty hungry. I should go get a snack. No, I'm not trying to get a snack. I'm trying to diet. But your digestive process is starting because of the association. Okay. So what are we to do about this? Well, I'll tell you in a little bit. That we don't have to necessarily. People do get over their drug cravings, and they do get over their food craving, and it happens through a process of extinction, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. There's even more examples of conditioning. Now, I don't use the word classical conditioning because these are examples of conditioning that don't necessarily fit the rules of classical conditioning. But psychologists have determined that taste aversions happen because of a similar process, a similar learning process as classical conditioning. So if you've ever gotten food poisoning, or if you've ever been sick because of a food, this can happen because a previously neutral stimulus, or even a pleasurable experience, food, ends up getting paired with an unconditioned stimulus, which is an illness, okay, the actual getting sick, which leads to the unconditioned response, that is feeling nauseous, feeling sick. Now, and this can also happen, it's at least thought that phobias are due to a result of a similar learning process. Okay, so a phobia is just a strong or irrational fear of a specific object or activity or situation. So a very distressing event, like maybe nearly drowning in a pool, can then cause a phobia of being afraid of water, or being more specifically afraid of pools. Okay, being, say, getting locked in a room. This unfortunately happened to my son when he was at summer camp. He got locked in a changing room. So then being afraid, or even having a phobia of enclosed spaces, can be the result of this one-time kind of traumatic event or learning experience. So what you see with both taste aversions as well as phobias is that they don't quite fit as examples of classical conditioning, because the association can happen in just a single pairing. That there's something that is so unpleasant, so noxious and aversive as getting physically ill, that then even the sight and the smell of that food can lead to nausea. Okay, something so distressing as nearly drowning in a pool, or being locked in a room, can then lead to a phobia. Phobias will be something that I talk about in future modules when we go over mental illness and mental health. Okay, so are we stuck with all the associations that we've learned in our brain? No, not necessarily. So what Pavlov was able to show is that it is possible to extinguish conditioned responses. Okay, so classical conditioning can be undone, and it's essentially through using the reverse method. So the response to the conditioned stimulus can be eliminated if the conditioned stimulus is presented repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus. So in this case, after a dog has been conditioned, the bell leads to salivation, but it doesn't last forever. So after many trials in which the bell is sounded and then there's no meat, ultimately the dog will stop salivating because the conditioned response has been extinguished because there's no meat. So that association can get unlearned. Now, extinction takes significantly longer. Okay, so what Pavlov was able to show is that the dogs were quicker to learn the association, so it was quicker to condition them than it was to extinguish the response. And this can be unfortunate because, there can be, among humans, there's a psychological cost to breaking a habit. Our mind is very geared towards making sense of our environment, informing associations, and it can be very difficult to undo that. So it's so difficult, in fact, that some of Pavlov's work with his dog showed that it's even possible to have spontaneous recovery of a response. So that if time is allowed to pass and then there's extinction, that the presentation of the conditioned stimulus can still lead to the response again. Okay, so this is known as spontaneous recovery. So we've got the acquisition period, or the class. We can say that the period in which the dog learns to salivate at the presence of the bell when it's paired with meat. Okay, so that's acquiring the unconditioned response to the bell. So what Pavlov found then was that he can then go through an extinction period where he stops presenting the meat, and then ultimately the dog will stop salivating when there's only bell and no meat. But interestingly, what he found is that at the end of this first extinction period, even the conditioned stimulus was no longer producing salivation. The effects of conditioning had not entirely disappeared. So after a break, sounding the bell again elicited salivation, although to a lesser extent than before the extinction took place. Okay, so this was known as a spontaneous recovery period. So you can see that the bell produced less salivation than at first, okay, but there was still some there, and then salivation was entirely extinguished. But there was this period of spontaneous recovery. Okay, so spontaneous recovery basically means that after this pause or break, when the conditioned stimulus is presented again, the behavior may occur again and then ultimately show some extinction. And so this can happen with our learned associations as well, is that there can be spontaneous recovery. We thought we were over something, we thought we had kind of, unlearned it, but our associations can come back. But don't worry, they will ultimately go away. So another phenomenon to know for classical conditioning is the phenomenon of blocking. So blocking occurs when a previous association prevents a new association from being formed. So in our diagram here, we've got the sound of the bell that's been paired with food. The idea is that once an association is learned, in a second phase, a second stimulus, a light, would be presented along with the bell and then is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the cheese. So then what happens is that what we want to know is, okay, so we've paired this second stimulus with the original, with the original unconditioned stimulus, what will we then get when we present the light only? And the answer is you get nothing. So because the animal had previously learned the association between the bell and the food, adding the second stimulus does nothing. And this is known as blocking because the earlier conditioning of the bell blocks the conditioning of the light when the light is merely added to the bell. And so on its own, the light won't lead to the unconditioned response, or won't lead, and it will not become a conditioned response. All right, so a couple things to know about classical conditioning. The first is that classical conditioning generates a system of responses. We've talked about pretty simple things like just kind of a simple unitary response like salivation with Pavlov's dogs, but all kinds of an entire system of responses is typically generated. So even digestion, it's not just salivation that happens, but there's a whole system of digestion, gastric juices in the stomach, and whatever else. And the same thing with our responses as well. Second, classical conditioning can establish both preferences and aversions. So I've talked of examples of preferences as well as unpleasant associations and aversions like phobias and taste aversions. Classical conditioning underlies various psychological conditions, certainly phobias, also reactions to drugs, our body actually preparing itself and mobilizing in the anticipation of getting a particular drug. And the notion of a compensatory response is that we end up, this is why we ultimately need to use more, okay? Drink more coffee, vape more, smoke more cigarettes, is that our body actually gets used to it, builds a tolerance. And just the sight of particular stimuli, our body will start to prepare for a compensatory response to the drug, the stimulant, the depressant, whatever it is. Pairing an unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus does not always result in conditioning. First, as in classical conditioning, there need to be a sufficient number of trials to make the association. Okay, so in most cases, there need to be a sufficient number of pairings of the unconditioned stimulus with the conditioned stimulus to result in learning. Okay, and so if you don't have enough, you won't get the learning. Taste aversions and phobias are kind of special examples of that, but for many of our associations, we need the repetition and consistency of repeated exposures. Okay. In other situations, the phenomenon that I just talked about with blocking, once an association between conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus has been learned, as in the case of bell and food, adding another unconditioned stimulus with a light doesn't necessarily result in conditioning either. And so that's important to know for, hey, can I just like replace one thing with another? That second conditioned stimulus is not that second stimulus is not necessarily going to result in a conditioned response. All right, let's move to instrumental, otherwise known as operant conditioning. So B.F. Skinner was really the champion of operant conditioning. He was a professor at Harvard. He thought that free will was an illusion, right? So he thought that human action really was dependent on the consequences of previous actions. And he and other really like hardline behaviorists thought that we're born as blank slates. We didn't have any pre-existing programming. Okay, they were all on the nurture side. So anything that you would use to describe yourself, whether that's your traits, your skills, your preferences, all of these come from environment. And so in this view, we're born roughly with equal potential, so kind of barring any genetic disorders and things like that. And so the way that we get to be really comes from environment. And it was in this view that Skinner developed his theory of operant conditioning. He developed it because he thought that classical conditioning just was too simplistic to explain how behavior is influenced. Okay. Yes, he recognized that with classical conditioning, we associate things, but our behavior is more complex. So operant conditioning is a type of a learning process through which the strength of a behavior is modified, that is, made stronger or weaker, by reinforcement or punishment. Now, the best known example from Skinner was he would put animals in different, what were called operant conditioning chambers, which came to be known as Skinner boxes. But these were little boxes or cages or an apparatus. And so in the best known example, a laboratory rat learns to press a lever in a cage to receive food. He also did a lot of work with pigeons, and he showed that pigeons could learn to press different buttons when they were reinforced and got food as well. Okay, so again, really, operant conditioning is built on the foundation of rewards and punishments. When our behavior is rewarded, we're encouraged to repeat or continue that behavior. When behavior is punished, we're discouraged from continuing that behavior. So we form an association between the behavior and the consequence. When we're rewarded, we do more. When we're punished, we do less. Okay, so here's an image of an apparatus that Skinner used. He used a Skinner box. Okay, so the rat learns to press a lever whenever because the lever will release a food pellet. But you'll see there's other things like lights and loudspeaker. And so there's also an electrified grid for punishment. So he was an inventor, and he built these types of apparatuses as a way to study operant conditioning. At this point, I also want to make sure to distinguish between operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is an association between two events. Okay, I notice that there's this conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Bell and food. Okay, couch and food. Being in the car, cigarette. So there's an association between two things, and that leads to this response. Operant conditioning occurs when a behavior, okay, without the stimulus is associated with a significant event, either a reward or punishment. Okay, so it's the response to a particular behavior, and whether that response ends up being a reward or a punishment that gets learned. Classical conditioning, it's that we have a response to a stimulus. So you can think of with operant conditioning, there's not necessarily that association between the two stimuli, although we'll get into it more. Okay. So important to understand operant conditioning is to be able to differentiate between reinforcers and punishers. So in operant conditioning, anything that increases behaviors are reinforcers, and anything that decreases behavior are punishers. Now, we've got another dimension, which is positive and negative. So whenever you're trying to add something, okay, when you're trying to add something that wasn't there as a way to influence behavior, that's positive. Whenever you take something away to influence behavior, that's negative. And so we can have both positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. And this can get confusing for folks because positive is typically associated with good, and how can punishment be good? But that's because it's important to keep in mind the definition that positive, okay, in the framework of operant conditioning just means add something. It doesn't mean good, it just means that we're adding something. So let's go over some examples. So positive reinforcement is something that I think most of us are already familiar with. That's when you want to encourage a behavior, you give something you add something. In this case, you add something valued. So if I want to encourage my son to put his toys away, I might give him a treat like a cookie. Okay, so my son learns to put the toys away. So I'm trying to encourage the behavior by adding something good. However, the same behavior that I'm trying to encourage or get more of, putting toys away, I can try to encourage through negative reinforcement. With negative reinforcement, I take something away. Okay, it's negative because I take something away. And in this case, I'm going to take something bad away. And so parents do this with their kids all the time. Hey, if you put away your toys, you don't have to eat your broccoli. I know you don't like eating your broccoli, so I'll make you a deal. You just clean up your toys. I want you to do more of that. You don't need to eat your broccoli. Or you know how I always make you play with your annoying kid, brother or sister? Guess what? You put your toys away, then you can go do whatever you want to do, and you don't have to play with your kid, brother, or sister. So it's the taking away of the negative. That's negative reinforcement. We're taking something bad away in order to encourage more of the behavior that we want. Okay, positive punishment, despite the name, is actually what we know of as kind of traditional or typical punishment. So this is where we're trying to decrease a behavior by adding something bad, okay? So if your kid calls, another one of your kids a bad name, you might scold or spank their bottom. You're adding something bad, okay? Your kid picks his nose. You reprimand. Say, that's so gross. What are you doing? So that's actually a positive punishment. You're adding a reprimand or a scolding in order to stop the kid from doing that. Okay. Negative punishment would be when something that is valued or desired is removed after a particular undesired behavior is exhibited. Okay. So one time my kid was doing something that we told him not to do, talking back, being especially grumpy and bratty. And so my wife flipped out and took away all his toys. All of his loveys, all of his stuffed animals. Put them in a big bag and took them out to the garage. So this is taking something away. Taking away the valued, stuffed animals and his little loveys to discourage the negative behavior that we didn't want. Okay. So it can get kind of confusing, but the way that I think about it is positive reinforcement is what we typically think of as rewards, but positive punishment is typically what we think about as punishment. So just know that even though punishment is in the name, it doesn't mean that it's good. So positive punishment would be like reprimands, scolding, spanking as a way to stop the behavior. Negative reinforcement, take away something bad as a way to encourage the behavior. Negative punishment, kind of take away. I'm going to take away your video games if you don't stop doing this. Okay? All right. Now, rewards and punishment often go together. So for instance, many elementary school teachers use point systems for encouraging students to turn in their work. So when they turn in their work or when they do something good, they get points. That's positive reinforcement. That's rewards. Okay, so even in the classroom, teachers use behavioral modification techniques with the entire class. When the entire class is on task or paying attention, there's often these symbols of points like tokens. Hey, I'm going to put a token in the jar because of this behavior that everybody's on task, paying attention. I like this. I want to see more. Token goes in the jar. And you get enough tokens and you get something that is desired, like more recess or a game or a fun activity. However, that can also be, punishments can also be incorporated. So there can be negative punishment by taking away a token. So if what we see is that people are engaging in the behaviors that the teacher doesn't want, like bothering a classmate or playing with stuff that they're not supposed to, making noise, talking out of turn. Okay, to discourage those behaviors, the token can get pulled from the jar. So it's possible to use positive reinforcement and negative punishment kind of interchangeably to encourage the things that we want and discourage the things that we don't. Here's another clip from Big Bang Theory. This is kind of a fun example of operant conditioning. So hopefully that will reinforce the concepts for you. Do pay attention because they use the term negative reinforcement in the clip, but I want you to decide for yourself whether it was used appropriately or not. Many people ask, are rewards or punishments more effective? Here's what we can say. Generally speaking, if we want to encourage behavior, we use positive reinforcement. We give something valued as a way to encourage a particular behavior. So the behaviorists establish this pretty robustly. And then to discourage behavior, we give punishments. If we want to stop a behavior, we give something bad. Skinner did it with electrical shocks in the box, but there's ways to take away the tokens from the jar. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, and the effectiveness of rewards or punishment really do depend on several things, such as what it is specifically we're trying to encourage or discourage. Is it a behavior? Is it learning a new skill? The age of our learners makes a difference. So young children and adults. Is it the setting? Are we at home? Are we at school? Are we at work? Even the size of the reward can have differential effects. So these are just a couple of 4 instances just to make the point. So some research has shown that when you're trying to encourage children as well as young adults to look to perform well or learn basic cognitive tasks or rules, rewards end up being more effective for younger children, 8 to 11, but punishments are actually more effective on these simple cognitive tasks and learning rules for, in this study, was the age group 18 to 25. However, it's generally accepted that among adult employees in the workplace, positive reinforcement is generally considered most effective for encouraging new behaviors. Okay, so if you want to get people to take on behaviors that are outside of their job or their role or to learn new stuff, positive reinforcement is generally considered most effective. So that kind of goes against this age trend here, right? But it gets even more complicated because research also fairly robustly shows that really big rewards can end up hurting creativity. So employees are, we want to encourage employees for doing new and outside of the box and creative things. So we think, oh, well, let's reward that, right? Well, if the reward is too big, and many of us have experienced this, we experience a performance pressure, and we get so concentrated on the reward that can actually inhibit divergent or out-of-the-box thinking. Rewards can also kind of have this kind of insidious effect is that, what we'll get a lot of when we reward things is the specific behavior that we reward. And in that case, you end up getting people that are very sensitive to those rewards and only do the things that are rewarded and don't do anything else. Okay, that's something that's been established in employment settings. So we want really simple answers, but the truth is more complicated, okay? So the simplest answer that we can give is that in general, when we want to encourage behavior, positive reinforcement, and if we want to discourage behavior, punishment, okay? Generally speaking, that's going to be, we'll say, the correct answer most of the time. But as some of these examples hopefully illustrate, it's not nearly so simple. So just be a little skeptical if somebody tries to give very simple answers here. The truth is generally more complicated, and it depends on several factors, which I believe we kind of inherently know, but we often look to the advice of experts as wanting very simple answers And most often it isn't so simple. There are a couple things that we can say about punishments, though, especially when it comes to school age children. It has been very clearly and repeatedly demonstrated that punishment can be very effective to control behavior and discourage unwanted behavior. But many behaviorists and many school psychologists caution very strongly against punishment. And the reason is that we can often use reinforcers and rewards just as effectively as punishments. And there's often side effects with punishments that there aren't with rewards. Okay? So there's all kinds of side effects of punishments. So punishments often don't work because and can even lead to more of the undesired behavior, because punishment ironically often comes with attention, and attention is one of the most kind of valued rewards available. So you often get kids that act out and they end up getting punished, but they often don't mind getting the punishment because they're getting the attention from the adult. So that's one thing. Punishment also has side effects and can backfire because it often arouses strong emotional responses. Kids get very upset and mad when they're being punished. They also see that aggression can generalize. So using a punishment and using an adult authority figure that punishes, that becomes a model for punishing other kids. They also don't learn internal control of their behavior. So by having punishments, and especially harsh punishments, what kids learn to do is to stop the behavior because of the punishment, but not because they figured out how to do so necessarily on their own. Okay. And then finally, what kids often find a way to do is just not to get caught. So there's some reason that they're engaging in the behavior, the unwanted behavior. They know that they'll get punished. They just find a way to be more covert or to not do it. They're still going to do the behavior, just be less obvious about it. So if and when punishments are used, you want to be quick about it and you want to be consistent. And that just has to do with the basic learning principles, is that the child needs to form the association. And so that punishment needs to be right after the behavior. So they learn to associate the punishment with a specific behavior, and the punishment needs to be consistent so that the association is formed. One characteristic of authoritative versus authoritarian parents is that the punishment is explained. This is so the child understands and you don't get the negative emotional reaction or less of it. Importantly, there should be a suggestion as well as a means for an alternative behavior. Sometimes kids act inappropriately, and it's simply because they don't have an alternative. So find a good alternative, give them the means to engage in the alternative, and then reinforce that alternative. And that's likely going to be more effective, reinforcing an alternative than punishing the original. Don't be too harsh. The punishment should only be as severe enough to be effective. And then don't use physical punishment. So several groups like the National Association of School Psychologists have written position statements opposing corporal punishment, that is physical punishment that is meant to inflict pain in school settings. And the reason is you just get all these side effects, is it can really backfire when we use physical punishment or overly harsh punishment. All right. So other principles to learn from behaviorism and Skinner's operant conditioning is that instrumental responses can come under stimulus control. Okay, so what he was able to show is that he's able to get certain behaviors from the rats. Okay, like for instance, what Skinner was able to show is that he only got lever pressing from the rats if the lever pressing produced pellets when a particular stimulus was present. So you can reinforce the lever pressing only when a light is turned on. And then when the light is off, no food is released. So the rats were able to then learn that and say, okay, I'll press the lever when the light is on. If the light is off, I don't need to bother pressing it because I won't get any food. Okay, so the rats were very quickly able to discriminate between the light on and light off conditions. Okay, and this has to do with a discriminative stimulus. This is a stimulus that signals whether the response will be reinforced. It sets the occasion for the operant response. And so the light was functioning as the discriminative stimulus. And so Skinner was able to show with pigeons, for example, that they were able to peck at different buttons when and able to discriminate between things like pictures of flowers or cars or chairs or people. And so like pecking one button would be reinforced based on one image, but pecking another button would be reinforced based on another image. And so they would learn to peck the correct buttons based on which stimulus. And so he was actually able to show that, just putting the stimulus, the word peck, could get the pigeons to peck a particular button, right? And so he said, hey, look at how smart my pigeons are. They can read. Of course, they can't read. They're just recognizing that is a discriminative stimulus versus others, and they're pecking the right button. Now, children also show this same stimulus discrimination. And so you might notice how your child is like a perfect angel, or other children that you've been able to see, and they're perfectly well behaved in one setting, like school or karate class, and then completely misbehaved in other settings. Their behavior is under stimulus control, and they've been able to discriminate between one set of stimuli at school and another set of stimuli at home. So school versus home becomes the discriminative stimulus, and their behavior is under stimulus control at school, where they're rewarded for being on task. They're rewarded by getting tokens. So they've learned to associate that on-task activity with tokens, but only at school. At home, I can't tell you how many times I need to tell my son to do something, okay? Like put away the clothes. Hey, I thought I asked you to help with some chores around here, like folding the napkins or whatever it is, folding the towels. It is so difficult to keep him on task, but it's probably because I haven't done a good enough job of the positive reinforcement. He's not under stimulus control. The home setting he hasn't learned the association. It's also important to know that operant conditioning involves choice. So a rat chooses to press a lever instead of sleeping or scratching its ear. A student chooses to hang out with friends or watch some TV, or picks up an extra shift at work instead of studying. So there's alternative behaviors, and each alternative behavior is associated with its own reinforcer or reward. And so the quantitative law of effect says that the tendency to perform a particular behavior depends on the reinforcers earned for it and the reinforcers that are earned for the alternatives. And so the strongest link is going to be will do the best job at reinforcing a behavior when there's more reinforcement or reward for that particular behavior than there is for other alternatives. Okay, so in our example, when the reward of studying, okay, getting the A on the test is more valuable and more reinforcing than the good feeling that comes from hanging out with one's friends, you'll get more of the studying. If the good feeling from hanging out with friends is ultimately more reinforcing than the good grade, it's going to be harder to reinforce the studying with the good grade. Okay, so this was just shown in Skinner's work with the rats, is that, once a rat is full, the food doesn't have any value. Okay, so ultimately a reinforcer is only reinforcing to the extent it's valued, and the alternatives are valued less. So when sleep is ultimately more valuable, the pellet doesn't have the same reinforcement value. And we can apply these principles to our everyday lives as well. Okay, so things to know about instrumental conditioning. Instrumental responses can come under stimulus control. The idea here is that we can discriminate between stimuli, and we can get one set of behaviors in one setting and a different set in another. Operant conditioning always involves choice. This is the quantitative law of effect, is that the amount that we're able to reinforce a behavior will depend on the reinforcement that we get from alternative behaviors. Reinforcers are not all made equal. And this is where our kind of individualism comes in, is that people value different things more versus less. But it does depend on, when you're already full, food doesn't have any more value. When you're already rich, money has less value, right? So reinforcers are not made equal for different people and for different kind of conditions or situations in one's life. Okay, last thing that I'm going to lecture on is observational learning. So observational learning is very simply learning by observing the behavior of others. And Albert Bandura came up with a theory of observational learning, which was social learning theory. Specifically, he said that people learn by observing social models. Social models are people that are generally authority figures that are the target of the observation and who end up modeling the behavior. Importantly, this was kind of a reaction to behaviorism. And so Bandura came up with social learning theory in the 70s after these 3 decades, even 4 decades of behaviorism. And he said, you know what? Learning doesn't necessarily require reinforcement. Okay? This might actually seem quite obvious to us now, but this was not the established wisdom or paradigm in psychology. Basically, his theory said that in order to learn through observation, 4 things need to happen. One is that there needs to be attention. So the observer needs to be focused on the task that's being learned. Second, there needs to be retention. The observer has to retain the learned information in their memory. There needs to be initiation. The observer has to be able to perform the learned task. So they need the ability as well as the access to be able to perform the activity, to initiate it. And then finally, there needs to be some motivation. The observer must want to perform the learned task. Okay. So do we do everything and do we learn everything that we observe? No, certainly not. In order to learn by observing, we have to pay attention, we have to remember, we have to be able to have the ability to try to initiate the learned behavior or activity, and then we want to have to do it. So Albert Bandura is very, very famous for his Bobo doll experiment. And so in this experiment, and this is, I provide a link here, but in the experiment he had children, and he wanted to be able to see whether children would learn to behave aggressively by watching an adult model. So he had 3 different conditions in his experiment: an aggressive condition, a non-aggressive condition, and a control condition. He was very careful to pre-select the children to make sure that they were basically didn't have any aggressive personality types, and to make sure that he sorted the kids into the groups based on having roughly similar personalities. Okay, so he worked with teachers at a local nursery or preschool to do this. And so he set up 3 conditions. So in one condition, in the aggressive model condition, children witnessed an adult role model behaving in a very aggressive manner towards a toy. And then in the second one, the non-aggressive condition, they observed a non-aggressive adult who played with a toy in a non-aggressive manner, and then a control condition. So, so the Bobo doll experiment began by placing a child in front of a room with an adult. They sat in one corner of the room with a few appealing toys to play with. The adult sat in the other corner of the room, as well as with this Bobo doll toy, which is this inflatable thing. It's got a weight at the bottom. It's kind of one of these punching bags thing. So for children in the aggressive group, after 1 minute of playing with the toy, the adult began to verbally and physically attack the doll. And you can see it in the video. Here's some pictures. It's kind of crazy, but, you know, like would straddle it and punch it in the face and throw it up and kick it and yell at it. In the non-aggressive group, the adult would just sit quietly and play peacefully for 10 minutes. In the control group, there's no adult present. So in the next stage of the experiment, the child would get taken to another room, which was filled with interesting toys, but they weren't permitted to play with the toys. And then this was intended to build up levels of frustration in the kid. Then the kid was taken to yet another room filled with toys, some of which were aggressive, some were non-aggressive, and it also contained the Bobo doll. And so the child is then watched through a one-way mirror. So the experimenters measured physical aggression, verbal aggression, all kinds of things like the number of times that the kid hit the toy, the number of times that the kid hit the Bobo doll with the hammer, just like the adult did. So ultimately what they found is that children who were exposed to this aggressive adult were more likely to imitate the aggressive behavior themselves. They also found, they were interested in gender differences, they also found that boys were nearly 3 times more likely to replicate the physically violent behavior than girls were. Children in the experiment with a non-aggressive model showed very little imitation of the aggressive behavior. Okay, so basically what this study showed is that in the absence of any reward, children will learn and they will model the behavior of an adult or a social model. Now, what about the idea of reward and punishment? So Bandura was interested in this as well, and he was also interested in whether learning reward and punishment could be learned through observation and not directly experienced. So he used a similar experiment to the Bobo doll, and what he wanted to show is that in one condition, the adult got rewarded, okay, by giving, I think it was sweets and a drink, but another group saw the adult being punished for the aggression to the Bobo doll by being scolded. And then a third group saw no specific consequences, which was the control condition. So when the kids then were allowed to enter the room and play with the Bobo doll, the children in the reward conditions, as well as the control conditions, imitated the aggressive acts more so than the kids that were in the punishment condition. So the children that saw the adult that was punished and scolded learned that the aggression, not to imitate the aggression, and they learned that merely by observing somebody else get punished. Okay, the other kids learned that they would just go ahead and basically repeat the behavior if it was either rewarded or if nothing was done. Okay, so this is the principle of vicarious reinforcement. So this is learning that occurs by observing the reinforcement or punishment of another person. So merely seeing somebody else get punished for a behavior can lead to a decrease in that behavior, even if a child doesn't get directly punished themselves. Okay, and again, the really notable thing about the Bobo doll experiment, which was kind of flipped behaviorism on its head, and very few people were strict behaviorists after this, is to say learning can take place without reward or punishment and merely through observation. Okay, so that link is there for you. So I hope after watching this lecture, you have a better understanding of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, and that you can kind of appreciate and reflect on all the instances in your life in which you've learned associations through classical conditioning, when you've learned to modify your behavior either because of the presence of rewards or punishments, and also if you can just reflect on all of the things that you've come to know, not because it's happened to you directly, but because you've merely observed others. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Thanks so much for watching.